Hello, everyone. I'm Ritula Shah. Welcome to this Agile Rabbit event, which is taking place as part of the University of Exeter's Exchange Symposium, organised by Arts and Culture Exeter and the Public Engagement with Research team. We're going to have about 45 minutes or so of chat on tonight's theme, which is of course, the relationship between online technology and data. If there's time, I hope we'll come to some of your questions at the end. So do keep submitting them via the chat. We'd love to hear from you. We have got a fantastic panel. Let me begin by introducing them all to you. Glen Weyl works for Microsoft. He advises its senior executive team on geopolitics, macroeconomics, and the future of technology. He's also the founder of the Radical Exchange Foundation. Henry Farrell is the SNF Agora Professor of International Politics at Johns Hopkins University. He's also the 2019 recipient of the Frederick Schiedel Prize for Politics and Technology. Reema Patel is the Associate Director at the Ada Lovelace Institute and has worked for the organisation from its foundation. She was part of its founding team. The Ada Lovelace Institute uses research methodologies to explore socio-technical questions relating to data and AI. Welcome to you all. It's fantastic to have you all here. Let's begin with the basics. Glen, data is a really wide term. When we're talking about it in relation to the big tech companies we've all heard of, like Facebook and Google and so on, what kind of data are they interested in? What are they collecting? And what do they want when we visit their sites?
So it really depends on exactly which company you're talking about and exactly which business model. If you want to get down to a granular level of detail, Facebook and Google are mostly interested in purchase intent data. Like they're interested in what things give good signal of your interest in potentially buying things. And a branch of Microsoft that runs Bing is also interested in that. In a looser way, Amazon is focused on that. But I actually don't think that that is the most interesting direction for the future. I think we often get distracted by the moment right now versus the way things are going. And the way things are going and where all the investment is in language models. So there are increasing attention being given to training these very, very large models that require billions of dollars of investment just to train them once. And these are mostly not about specific purchase intent prediction so that we can serve you ads or know, what are the most lucrative search terms or something like that. Instead, these are focused on more fundamental sort of unstructured understanding of how to produce human language, to process images, to produce images, to, put captions under films, etc. And that's actually quite different than the conversation that's being had most, usually about, how do I figure out the best way to sell you a can of crisps or something like that.
So you're talking about the application that some people may understand as AI. I want to stay with the narrow interpretation just for a moment, just to get people to understand the scope of what we're talking about. Reema, if we think about that narrow definition of data that many of us, in a sense, perhaps have now come across, how important is it just as a business model? How are people making money from it?
So on what is data, I mean, it's really quite simple. It's information, and that simple definition is something to really work with. So what's changed isn't the question of information and information gathering, but rather the scale and the extent to which that happens and the processing by which that happens. So at Ada, we call this datafication. So the increasing intensity of datafication. We've always had data collection through things like censuses, et cetera, but the number of actors that are now able to gather and collect data, their technical capabilities, machine learning is one of that, means that the scale of that data collection has become more intensive. It's also meant that people are increasingly less aware of that scale of data collection. So to give an example, such as Google, you've got search engine processes that allow you to type in a term, work out what's happening. But if you combine that with Google's ability to know where you are because you're on Google Maps, and Google's ability to collect every single search term that you've ever put in, and to do that at scale. So, millions and millions of people over the world do that. The capabilities that Google then has is changed. So it allows them certainly to profile at an individual level, but it also allows them to then sell that capability to companies and through advertising, for instance, and monetize that. And that's where things get both interesting, controversial, and challenging.
And is the pact that we as users have done essentially that we've got free Google for giving Google our data?
So that's the essence of the challenge in many respects. That there's been a kind of perception that the access to that data has been, or data-driven service has been free, without a comprehensive or full awareness of what has been exchanged for that, and also the sort of question of what the short-term benefits are, certainly, and the long-term drawbacks or disadvantages. And one of the big challenges, of course, is that this is all rather opaque. We don't actually know what's happening with that information, or what the boundaries are around that. That's not very obvious, not very transparent. So that also raises lots of significant challenges. So it's one of those really interesting contexts where you can't live without the service. Or, certainly I use Google Maps, but there's also the alternative, which is that a number of us would prefer, if we had the choice or the ability to do so, to access similar services, but perhaps in more privacy-friendly or enhancing ways.
Glen, I promise I will come back to your bigger point. I think it's a really, really important one and fundamental to the conversation we want to have. But on this narrower point, how do you see this pact? Is this sort of a pact that we've all done? We've gone into this idea that the internet should be free, services should be free, but actually we're giving away our data. That's the deal.
I mean, look, the first thing that we're giving away is attention and exposing ourselves to advertising. And that is not all that fundamentally different than what we do with newspapers or anything else. Now, there's a question of how effective do you think that ad targeting is? And do you think that both negatively impacts, manipulates you, leads you to buy things you don't want? I think people have very heterogeneous experiences of that. I think for some people, they really get stuck in dark patterns using that. I think for other people, maybe they hardly click on advertisements at all, and it's just something annoying that they ignore or block or look the other way at. And I think different people have different experiences of that, and people should keep in mind what their own experience of advertising is. There's a second use of data, even at present, which is more related to the long-term uses of data, which has to do with optimizing the cycle to capture your attention. And that's not really directly about advertisement. That's about monitoring your consumption behavior in order to try to optimize the service to you of various things, which could be beneficial under certain circumstances. I think, for example, Yelp actually doesn't do a very good job of this, but you imagine that Yelp optimized your preferences over restaurants and served you restaurants that you particularly like. I think many people would view that as a benefit to them. On the other hand, it enhances the market power of someone like Yelp. There's other cases where we probably think it's not a benefit to most people, where it fuels addiction. It fuels very short-term rewards, where we serve you a video that's entertaining in the moment, but that maybe afterwards you regret having watched. And there's a lot of evidence that happens, especially on Facebook. How much it happens on Google, another question. I'm not sure if in an informational search that's really happening. On YouTube, I think there's quite a lot of suggestive evidence that it is happening. So I think you have to be a little bit careful, because data can be very abstract and it's being used in different ways. And sometimes our concern with it is a privacy concern. Sometimes it's a sort of addiction concern and an over-optimization concern. Sometimes it's a concern about us not getting a fair share of the value in entrenching the market power of a few incumbents.
So from your point of view, Glen, where you're really trying to get down into the various iterations of data, do you think that people who are only really beginning to grasp this now, do you think they have any sense of their relationship with the companies which may be taking their data and using it in all the ways you've just described? And the idea of trust, does it affect that relationship? Does it make us mistrust them, or does it make us think, as Rima was alluding, that sometimes, well, great, Google Maps actually works really well. How do we perceive that relationship?
I think it's a risky one of we have trust for a time until something gets broken, or until we, in a longer term, notice that there's some pattern that works against our interest. And this is why I think it's really important that people have collective representation by people who have more time to look into what those risk factors are, and then can put pressure on the companies to address them. It's not something that is, I think, in the individuals and probably not even in the company's interest in the medium term to be addressed primarily through individuals trying to anticipate everything or understand fully the contract. We don't do that with medicine. We get advice from doctors. We don't do that in the workplace. We have representation from unions. So I think putting all the burden on the individuals is sort of the original sin here.
Henry, if I can bring you in for a moment then, when you think about this question of trust and people perhaps rethinking the way they view the use of data, what in your mind would be one or two of the key events? Cambridge Analytica is one that many people may know about and would come to mind.
Well, here, like Glen, I think that there are some real question marks about how effective the techniques that were used by Cambridge Analytica and similar people actually were. And so there is a lot of speculation, but we don't really have strong evidence that Cambridge Analytica type techniques can be used to manipulate people at scale into believing stuff that they don't want to believe. So that is, I think, there's a lot of questions, because clearly, if you're in one of these business models, as Glen says, or as Rima has discussed, you're thinking very much about how to make your advertising more effective. And there are some suggestions, at least, that these models may not be as good at getting people to click as they are meant to be, which means that some of the questions about manipulation can be, it may be not as much of a problem as people think. But where there is a problem, this gets back, I think, to the questions that were raised already, is that if you think about how these kinds of processes work of artificial intelligence or machine learning, which are applied to these forms of data, really what they do is they try to put you into categories of one sort or another. Categories of people who might buy this thing, categories of people who might not buy this, and so on and so on. And this is something that we've seen a lot of in markets throughout the years. And we've seen, for example, much more overt and crude categories being used, for example, along racial lines in the United States back in the 1940s, 1950s. If you were in an African-American neighborhood, you would not be able to get a mortgage except at punitive and exorbitant, under punitive and exorbitant conditions because of the place that you were. But then because people were identified this way, it was possible for African Americans to organize and eventually to fight back. But the problem was a lot of the ways that data is analyzed, and this gets back to what Glen was saying about how we need intermediaries, is that it's often very difficult. Say, for example, if you're being categorized by machine learning processes as somebody who's going to be offered not good bank loans at reasonable rates, but instead extortionate rip-off bank loans, you probably don't have any very good way of understanding this. You don't have any very good way of understanding what category you've been placed into. And it's very, very hard to organize together with others in order to try and push back. So I think a lot of the feedback loops that guide us and that help to correct some of the tendencies in societies, many of these feedback loops are much, much more difficult to achieve in the new world of data and machine learning that we're entering into.
So Glen, could the sort of intermediaries... Yeah,
go ahead. A very sharp example of this. Like there's a moment happening right now that I think really brings this to the fore. There's a proposal by Google now that they're trying to move away from cookies, which track individuals, to do something that's called federated learning of cohorts. Federated learning of cohorts is a complicated way of saying that rather than tracking you specifically, they're going to, in some way that is not visible to them, but is based on an algorithm that they run, find a group of people that you're very similar to that is sort of going to run in the background, and then they'll track that group. And they'll
So they're
target
putting you
that group.
into a group. They're deciding who
Well,
you're like.
It's not exactly they that are doing it. So it's not like they can look at the things and whatever. It's actually happening on your phone in the background, in a way that is connected to the other phones or the other
interesting
computers.
question. The interesting question is who is involved in that process of categorization, and who determines how those groups are classified. But just to go back to another question, which is around the effectiveness of these approaches, I don't really understand why a tech company or Silicon Valley company would put billions of dollars and pounds into mechanisms that they felt didn't work. And advertising companies as well. So it's an interesting question, but there's also a really interesting question around relative to more traditional forms of advertising. It does look like the money has generally tended to follow the effectiveness of these.
Well, I mean, Rima, I think that the issue is that precisely they sell it as effective to the advertisers, but that doesn't mean that there's actually evidence supporting that. Like, I think that the problem is we can fall into the trap.
But if you sell more products off the back of funding that, that at the end of the day, if you're a company and you're making a choice, your question is going to be, do I sell more products off the back of funding X, or do I sell more products off the back of funding Y? So it's an interesting debate, but I think there's something about not just dismissing it as ineffective and therefore not.
No, I wouldn't dismiss it as ineffective, but I also think there's a danger of us buying the BS that the companies are selling to sell to the advertisers and treating it as if they have this magic machine, when in reality it's not clear how well the machines actually are working. But anyway. All right,
I think what we all do agree on is the idea that there is value in these different kinds of data, otherwise perhaps they wouldn't be farming them quite so assiduously. If to go back to this question of intermediaries then, and how they might work, I'm going to spool back a little bit. Glen, you've talked about something which is the idea of data as a form of labor. Just explain that to us a little bit.
So this is mostly not focusing on the targeted advertising context, just to be clear. It's mostly focusing on the way in which things train models or produce these artificial intelligence algorithms. But just to take an example that was recently released by Microsoft, we put out a large model that takes in basically the corpus of GitHub, all the code that people are writing, open source, public license code, and then uses that to generate code. You type in, I want an algorithm that does this following kind of search, and then it generates the code that does that for you. And I think there's a real question there of when people put out code, and in fact, this has been coming up on Twitter quite a lot, into the GitHub repositories under a general public license, were they anticipating that work was going to be used by other people who would then put their code into general public licenses? Or were they anticipating that it was going to be consumed by artificial intelligence that would then use that output to possibly endanger their livelihood in the future, right? So there's all this valuable information being created.
And just spell out what you mean by endanger their livelihood in the future. You're talking about the possibility of AI making jobs redundant, whether it's
the
lawyer or a doctor,
for example, right? I mean, why do you hire a programmer? Presumably often it's because you have some natural language thing you want to accomplish, and then you need it to be turned into computer code, right? I mean, I guess many people, I'm not saying that's the only role of a coder, right? But that's one way that people think about what a coder does. If those people are creating all this code and putting it out there, and then it's being used by some system to create something that makes them redundant, I think there's a lot of reasons why people might think, well, isn't that my work? Don't I sort of own that thing that's being created on the basis of this? And this is just one example. Whenever you fill out a reCAPTCHA online, to get on access to a website, you're training artificial intelligence algorithms that may be used, for example, to do self-driving cars. That's why you see all those things of
Traffic lights,
the street and traffic lights and so forth, right?
bridges.
And so if you're, for example, a taxi, driver, you might wonder, like, why isn't part of my livelihood that's going to be replaced by these things, shouldn't it be supported by the work that I'm doing to register for these websites?
Rima, what do you think about this idea as data, as labor, thinking of data in that way?
So I think if we start from the standpoint of companies positioning themselves effectively as data analytics companies, so Facebook, Google, really interesting in that respect, because whilst they offer a particular type of service, where they create their value comes from this advertising and data analytics, and working backwards from that, the interesting question is, how do you create value if you're a data analytics company? And the way you create value, or certainly position yourself as having competitive advantage, is by having better, richer, more in-depth data. That then leads you back to how then would you design a platform or a set of technologies, which leads back to the idea that you're designing your technologies or your platforms or your services in ways that encourage and incentivize people to spend as much time as possible on them, share as much as possible about themselves on them, and do that in ways that they don't really realize. So that, again, not very obvious, because if it was obvious, then it would be very difficult to position yourself as, or be able to gather and generate that thing that creates market value. So it's a really interesting conceptualization, data as labor. And I think that's the person that's written the most about this is Shoshana Zuboff, who's written a piece of work on surveillance capitalism that she introduced in the frame that she uses, which is that behavioral interaction have replaced traditional labor in the sort of dynamic between labor and capital in the sort of new era where capital is a data analytics form of capital, et cetera. It's just one way of many of thinking about data. So the other one that I think is quite interesting is data as oil. So some people have framed it as a commodity, which is not what I agree with. And others have contrasted that with data as water, or as more like an environmental resource. So that's something that we're really interested in, because our interest is in this notion of societal value that comes from data, and also what does data stewardship look like? What does the responsible, ethical approach to managing data look like? That's something that we're incredibly interested in.
Henry, is there any jurisdiction that's thinking about data in this way?
The closest, and it's still not nearly as close as it ought to be, is the European Union. So you've seen over the last few years a change in antitrust, as they call on the side of the Atlantic where I usually live, or some more straightforwardly competition. There's been a big change in competition thinking in the European Union, which is also being reflected to some extent in the United States, where Lena Khan, who is a very strong critic of Amazon, was just appointed as the chair of the Federal Trade Commission, which is quite an extraordinary. She's a brilliant young lawyer, and she has been given this extraordinary opportunity to perhaps reshape the ways in which we think about platforms and data. But very roughly speaking, we're seeing a convergence where people are beginning to think about the size of these platform companies in combination with the power that they get from data, and also the power that they get to shape markets. If you think about Amazon, Amazon is both a company and it is a marketplace, and it is able to learn from the various actors that sell through it. It is able to shape the ways in which they behave, gather data from them in ways which perhaps talk to what Glen was just talking about with Rima, which is that, in a sense, they service so many laboratory rats who are running these things to figure out which products are interesting. And if Amazon gets data seeing that various people on its services are coming up with products that consumers like, then Amazon can replicate, or they can buy, or what have you. So you're seeing this change in thinking to really try and bring together different strains of thought to understand how power works in the economy, where you have data intersecting with privacy and with antitrust. And so this is beginning to create some new thinking about trying to perhaps push back against the power of some of these platforms, But we really are in very early days. And part of the problem is that much of the information that you would need in order to really figure out what is going on is proprietary information, which is held within the companies themselves. And very often you're left trying to guess from outside as to what is actually happening.
So Glen, to go back to your idea of intermediaries and talk about this, the value of data, very crudely then, should we be paid for it? If data is labor, should we be paid for our data somehow?
Well, so the first thing I wanted to highlight in response to the question you asked to Henry is that I think there are jurisdictions that are doing better but are less famous than the US or Europe. Estonia and especially Taiwan are miles ahead of what we're doing. And I think a trap that we get into is only thinking about the biggest places and looking at them as the necessary and only possible models. And Taiwan actually already is organized collective data representation and has an incredibly dynamic sector of building these civil society-based data coalitions.
And just to interject, I think they've got about 50% of the internet users joining these groups, which I thought was extraordinary.
Yeah. So I think we should look to those types of examples as better directions to go, but also they don't necessarily all involve payment. Payment is the appropriate approach for certain things that are replacing livelihoods, replacing labor. If the people are the sort of resource, then to steward that resource, you have to support their livelihoods. But there are other cases where the environment is the relevant resource, and stewarding the environment is what these companies need to be made to do. And there's other cases where there's just a understanding, like in a general public license, that there's a commons out there and that commons should be supported, in which case probably the appropriate thing is to ask that any model that gets made be put back into a general public license itself. So I think we need collective representation, we need collective bargaining. It's not that the outcome of that will always be a financial payment to the individuals who are in that. That's what a labor union does, but that's not, for example, what the Girl Scouts do. That's a collective representation where they even sell cookies, but that money goes back not to support wage payment to the girls involved, but to support the maintenance of that social infrastructure.
But so if we're thinking then of this as a sort of a common good, Rima, you talked about water or oil, and we think about the internet perhaps as a country. I'm trying to come up with analogies here. I mean, you could argue, though, that country is fracturing. I know Glen's just talked about Taiwan and Estonia, but Henry, many people would argue that the internet is now dividing into sort of three big regions: the EU, the US, and China, and then other people floating alongside it. I mean, does any of this work as the internet divides?
That's a really good question, and one that we don't have very good answers to. So I think so Glen is absolutely right that there is really interesting and innovative work being done in parts of the world which are not the big jurisdictions. Where the big jurisdictions are important is that these are the actors that have real international clout and have some possibility of imposing their preferences on others. And so it used to be that we saw a kind of what you might call a regulatory condominium, that is sort of a co-rule between the European Union and the United States as the two big powers. China was a standard taker rather than a standard maker. Increasingly, China is looking to exert itself internationally as well. And so we're going to see a lot of fights over data, and a lot of fights over data localization in particular, where you see, for example, China looking to have as much data held at home as possible, the European Union being skeptical about some of the ways in which the United States is using data, and activists such as Max Schrems, a young Austrian lawyer, who are really pushing and using the European Court of Justice to make it more and more difficult for companies like Facebook, for example, to transport data back and forth. And this is obviously an issue for the United Kingdom as well. United Kingdom has just gotten an adequacy judgment from the European Union, which means that for the moment at least, the EU says that you can send data back and forth reasonably freely between the EU and United Kingdom because the privacy rules are sufficient, but also this is a unilateral determination that the EU has made, which it can withdraw at any moment. And there are feisty data protection authorities and other commissioners who I think might look for, at some stage in the future, some kind of a case to fight in order to try and push back, for example, at the ways in which British surveillance, GCHQ, has been used against Europe. So we're going to see a lot of fights in the international arena.
And there are undoubtedly people in the UK who want to see a loosening of some of those restrictions that we saw under GDPR rules and so on. Rima, you wanted to come in.
Yes, I just wanted to point out the EU's new draft AI regulations are really interesting. They look like they're, about to introduce standards for the use of high risk or identified high risk intervention. Certainly been subject to a bit of criticism, but it's also the first comprehensive proposed regulatory framework around AI. So that's quite interesting. You're starting to see harmonisation and a standards-based approach across the EU, and undoubtedly that will have a knock-on effect elsewhere as well. I'm slightly less sceptical about that relationship between UK and EU. I still think there's a possibility and potential for soft norms, certainly, to influence UK public policy and approaches to standards as well. So that's an incredibly interesting thing. Biometrics is another area. So biometric data and facial recognition technology data is another area where the EU AI draft regulations look like they're making some clear strides, although there were murmurs about a ban that didn't proceed or come forward, despite a leaked white paper that initially proposed that. So that suggests that increasingly member states are getting into a more practical space in thinking about this. We haven't sort of seen measures or moves to assign an economic value to data, and I think that's because it's incredibly difficult to do. It's really contextual. It really is determined by use and application. There might be certain instances in which people will be really happy to share their data or have it be used for public benefit and public good, and wouldn't want to assign an economic value. So that's a really complicated topic, one maybe for another discussion, but I think there's good reason for why monetizing data is not the way forward.
Interesting. Glen, I mean, we often think, we've just talked about a slew of legislation there, but we often think about tech companies as operating beyond the law. They've created their own kind of ecosystem, and legislators are often far behind the tech companies. Do you think they are going to engage with this process? How do you think they will fit into any legislative agenda?
So I wanted to join Rima in praising what the EU is doing. I think the EU is really making quite a bit of progress, and I don't think the AI regulations are the only ones. The trio of Digital Markets Act, Digital Governance Act, I forget the third, Rima will probably remember, have been quite interesting. And it's been, in my mind, an example of legislators not necessarily being behind. I actually think in many cases the tech companies are behind. One great example of this is in federated learning. This is an area where there's been a huge amount of research progress, and the tech companies have actually been quite slow to adopt it at scale. But the legislation explicitly anticipates it. And I often think that this assumption that the public sector is always behind the private sector can turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I would really love to see the public sector, in sort of the spirit of what Mariana Mazzucato has been advocating, doing a lot more mission-oriented innovation. The internet came from mostly a public sector effort collaborating with universities. And this notion that like the private sector is always in the lead is really a come out of the last 30 years of really, I think, economists who are very sort of conservative and slow thinking, capturing the policymaking process and slowing everything down. And we need much more of a leadership of cross-sectoral collaboration. I mean, of course, that requires the government to be more agile and to open up to, hackathons and this sort of thing like they do in Taiwan. But I think there's really the potential for the public sector to play a critical role in collaboration with the civil sector in leading the next, round of innovation to actually push things forward much more effectively than we've gotten it in sort of the proprietary closed platforms that have come to dominate during this kind of neoliberal period.
Henry, can you see a situation when the horse really is in front of the cart? Because it does feel like for some years the tech companies have been way ahead of governments and legislators.
Well, I think that one thing that has changed, which is important, is that this is now political in a way that it wasn't. And this is, I think, thanks to the work of people like Rima and Glen and others, that certainly in Europe, there used to be all that many people, apart from the diehard activists who are particularly concerned with these questions. And now you see this really beginning to, it's hit the headlines and people are genuinely concerned. They're not necessarily always as fully informed as they might be. And I think that companies are sometimes less powerful than we might think. And they certainly feel themselves to be on the defensive at the moment in the United States and elsewhere. There was if you saw yesterday, there was a thing going around on Twitter where you see Facebook, for example, looking to hire approximately 130 odd people in its government relations department in the United States. That is to say, it's lobbyists. And you see many other companies which are also staffing up. So they clearly have a lot of resources to bring to the game, but they're also somewhat nervous. And in the end of the day, businesses can be extraordinarily powerful, but they don't have the same kind of power as states and governments do once states and governments have decided that they wanted to do stuff. And so you see also, for example, Microsoft, Glen's employer, Brad Smith, who is a senior official at Microsoft, has proposed what he calls a digital Switzerland, that is to try and figure out some set of rules under which tech companies could have some safe harbor from clashing and competing state demands, because very clearly they're not in the world that they used to be, where they could demand to stick with self-regulation. They're finding themselves being besieged, sometimes by pretty nasty governments, sometimes by less nasty governments, but they're not as much in control of the political agenda as they used to be.
Well, I'm going to pour some cold water over all this optimism, really, because Rima, we were talking about, engaging people and the good work that people like you and Glen have done. But honestly, your average person out there who is scrolling through their Facebook or is, hooked on their YouTube videos or whatever it is, and I don't see myself as being above this in any sense. Do we really care? How are you going to make them engage and realize that this stuff matters?
Well, I thought the response to Cambridge Analytica and Facebook illustrated a bit of a watershed moment and a dawning realization amongst many people that, yes, we do care. And up until that point, I'm not quite sure that societal conversation had begun. If you look at over the past year, conversations around things like digital contact tracing or vaccine passport, these are all highly topical data-driven technologies and systems. I think it's really clear that people do care, but they may not necessarily use the terms that we use or the frames that we take. Increasingly, you can't separate data and AI from a lot of really important societal questions and challenging questions, and we're beginning to see that become more apparent.
So to bring that big question up that you raised almost at the top, Glen, do you think that relationship between data and AI makes an already quite, if you like, esoteric idea for many people? Does it make it even less graspable, even harder to communicate, and yet it's even more urgent?
So yes, we describe this at Ada as the double glazed glass ceiling. You've got issues and topics that are already quite complicated, like in healthcare or in COVID-19, the public health operations strategy. And then when you layer on technical systems and then use terms that are very difficult to communicate very effectively, that makes it really difficult for people to influence outcomes, etc., etc. So that's really challenging. It isn't just about communication, though. It's also about a lot of what we discussed, the business models and clarity and transparency there, which requires more than just good communication or using the right terms of the frame. But good communication, I think, is a really good starting point.
Glen, I wonder what you make of that.
I mean, I would just come back to the point of collective organizing. There's always been challenging issues. We, for example, consider utilities. Utilities were always, there's no way that the public could directly regulate them. We had utility boards with people drawn from the community who had some expertise in that. It didn't work perfectly, but I think that was critical to allowing for any sort of democratic accountability from those very powerful companies. And I think we have a very similar challenge today of how do we organize collectively to allow for the possibility of people having, real democratic accountability. And there's the energy there. Think of all the time that people spend, I would argue in many cases, waste on national politics and fighting each other over the same standard divides. We know that democracy grows strongest when many people are engaged in more local levels. Internet has made those local levels less physically local and more about the ways in which they interact in online domains. If we can channel even a fraction of the civic energy that we see people online bringing to national political debates to governing the interactions that they have and the way that their data are used, I think we have the potential to really reshape things. We just need to capture that sense of people forming a new collaborative public online, the way that Wikipedia has, the way that Taiwan has, et cetera.
Henry, I'm going to give you a chance to respond to that too, but I'm also going to drop in, it seems quite a good moment, a question from Sean Brosnan. He says, if we were to reboot the system, then where would we stand with the years of information they have on us already? So how optimistic do you feel about trying to persuade people to care? And actually, isn't the genie well and truly out of the bottle already?
Well, sometimes people care in odd ways, and they don't have these, and this goes back to what Rima says, that sometimes they frame it in different ways than we might think. And in the United States, for example, a lot of the pushback from against big tech is coming from the right, and it's coming from people on the right who see this on the one hand as being a populist issue, and on the other hand are looking at all of these companies which are doing things to Donald Trump which they love. So this is, on the one hand, this represents a lot of the pathologies of American politics. On the other hand, there's the fact that both sides of the aisle are yelling at big tech means that some things are possible which might not have been possible otherwise, and might not be possible on other issues in a very much deadlocked framework. So I think that things can happen. There is a lot of, maybe I'd reinterpret Sean's question saying that there's a lot of path dependence, which is to say that there are a lot of established practices, and these are always going to be incredibly technical issues, which means that, first of all, even politicians, not even only politicians, but even engineers very often don't understand very well what things like federated learning actually mean in practice. So it's very, very hard to evaluate their political consequences. It will always be possible for companies to do end runs around regulation. So there is always going to be a lot of trouble, a lot of problems, but I do think that the politics are a little bit more active in this space than they were otherwise. Whether they're going to turn towards the truly optimistic Taiwan way of thinking about things, where you actually get people engaged en masse in a genuinely civic way, that I think is still an open question.
But Glen, just to pick up on that, then, isn't there a danger, though, if this becomes politicized, if this is a debate that's seen through the prism of right and left, especially when your politics is as polarized as it is in the United States?
Yes, there is. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please, Henry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say yes, there is, but in a sense, you work with what you've got.
The thing is, I don't think local. Sorry, Rima.
Maybe this is just a transatlantic difference, but one of the really striking features in the UK is that here it's not particularly politicized. I mean, it's not that you would associate right and left with a particular view on access to data and AI. And maybe that's just, a feature of the way politics works. It works a bit differently in the UK. So I'd be really interested to hear about that. But I feel that almost in some ways there is limited scrutiny by parliamentarians and politicians in the UK when it comes to the users of data and AI. So I'd be quite interested to hear whether that's different culturally across the Atlantic.
I don't think that the goal, Rutula, should be politicization in the sense of the national political cleavages. I think there's many other cleavages, and if you look at local politics, national stuff has been creeping in more and more, but at least in the most functional periods, it was quite divorced from a lot of the national political debates. And I think it would be great for us to eventually get to the point where we have lots of politics, and a lot of it is sort of local to different digital communities' issues. And then, of course, there's also going to be broader politics. But I think politics, you know, the politics of a workplace, the politics of a you know, town hall, the politics of a Girl Scout, Boy Scout troop, the politics of the basketball court, the politics of the local teacher, you know, school board. We need more of that online, I think.
Mm. And Rima, this is a point that in a sense I should have brought up a little bit earlier, but is really pertinent to what we're talking about now, is the evidence that actually data itself can be biased. There have been hints of that in the past, you know, the computer that suddenly speaks and is incredibly sexist and things. I mean, what is the real evidence that data can bring out biases?
So there's a few different examples of context in which that happens. So that points around again about who is it that collects and gathers the data in historic examples. You know, historically, if people have given loans off the back of biases that they might have had, they may have discriminated historically against people from ethnic minority background. If then those data sets are assembled and used and then help inform new, you know, algorithms, et cetera, you can end up with different types of bias in the system, and an assumption that the system is neutral when actually the data sets informing the system are not neutral. So there's lots of different examples where that's happened. You've got, you know, the Tay-bot, for instance, that ended up training off very abusive behaviour and then perpetuating trolling against minority groups there. That's a really good example again, where it's not like someone sat down and went, let me design a system that was going to be discriminatory, but it learns from what it saw as behaviour online, and then replicated those challenges. The other thing that's quite interesting is around bias by decision makers who are affected by their perception that a system is more neutral than it could be. We saw this quite a lot in the off-qual exam modelling algorithm scenario, but the rather uncritical decision made by our Department for Education to adopt an algorithm using data about people's past performance in order to predict what their grades should be in the last year, that is, you know, it didn't really consider a range of factors that should have been considered, and that resulted in a great societal furor. So that's a really good example of someone from the Department of, or team from the Department for Education saying, we've got a problem, let's try and solve it. Let's solve it in this way. But there would have been, again, biases in the way that exam marks are awarded, et cetera, et cetera. So that's another good example of biases by human decision makers affected or the perception that a system is more neutral than it's.
So in a sense of failure to think about the limitations of the data that you have. A question that's come up from Twitter, Glen, one for you perhaps. Why is only big tech represented at the tech trust and ethics conversation that we're having now? Is it just big tech that we should be thinking about, or is that a sort of a false premise from the start?
Do you mean who is able to speak on this topic, or
no,
who is the target of
who's the target? Is it big tech that we should always be worrying about?
I certainly wouldn't make it the only one. I mean, I think some of the most unethical practices that we see today are actually by small data brokers who have very little public transparency or accountability, use small apps that you allow to track you to circulate your data to places like ISEC. There was a really great example of this that just came out a few days ago of some small apps that were being, where people's analytics were being sold to the US military and immigration and customs enforcement. Apple's trying to address this with some of the changes to its privacy settings. And the environment may shift on this, but at least in the in the cookie era, there have been a lot of these small data brokers who I think are some of the most concerning players in the space.
And on that question of bias, one of the things that I was wondering was when you were talking about the role of these sort of intermediaries that would gather our data and if you like, act as the sort of the intermediaries between us and the tech companies. I mean, would they be able to iron out some of those questions of bias? Is that one of the things that would get sorted?
So this is the really interesting bit around the draft EU AI regulations, because there are some proposals in there that require developers to consider bias. The only problem is defining how broad or how narrow that is, because the way I described bias earlier, it's not like bias is an inherent feature of a technical system. There are other elements, there's that point, which is what goes in and then what comes out, and then also how what comes out influences decisions made by a human being. So that makes it incredibly complicated. And I would suggest that having that broader analysis would imply that we can't just there is a really important role for developers, but it's actually a broader societal responsibility to understand what happens when data, comes with certain caveats and we don't really know what the quality of it is, or we know it's variable in its quality, and that kind of needs to encourage a certain sense of humility about it, agency and its power.
Glenn, what do you think?
I mean, I think data collectives can play a role. I think you think about the way that like newspapers have played a role in maintaining a reputation for some kind of objectivity or some kind of balance, or whatever, like whether even if it's a newspaper has a left leaning or a right leaning, and then you also contact a newspaper with another kind of leaning. I think these types of intermediate institutions that represent different communities can be a useful way of thinking about balance and participation.
So pick the biases that you want to align with in a way.
Or ensure that you have both or different representation from different types of groups. Yeah.
Okay, so look, we're almost out of time, but I'm going to ask you a few personal questions, if you like, or at least one personal question, which, I mean, you're all very data conscious, but I mean, do you go on social media? Henry, how do you operate in this environment? Do you say yes to every cookie that you come across, which I'm trying not to do, but I find that I do most of the time? I'll have all of the cookies in that jar, please. I mean, how much do you protect yourself? Are you on Facebook?
Well, it's really difficult. I'm not on Facebook because of the issues associated with it. I try to sort of click off on the major websites, the major programs that I use. I try to make sure that I provide as little information as possible. But I also recognize that that what I'm doing, it moderates the problem to some degree, but it really doesn't control it. So that there, so that you walk around, so you generate data, whether you like it or whether you don't, and trying to keep track of how that data is used is extraordinarily difficult. And I think we're really entering into a world. So first of all, with things like if you think about the way that visual surveillance is being automated, that is a particular problem in the United States. We're seeing a lot of evidence now of how it is that police are using using data to keep track of what people are doing. And the other problem, which I think is an interesting problem, which is worth coming back to, is what Glen was talking about in the beginning, which is natural language processing and the ways in which this is, and so gathering huge amounts of information, but also to train this, you need huge corpuses of information, and this reproduces bias at a societal level. If you use, for example, GPT-3, which is one of the standard packages, there are various implementations, you find sort of a lot of pretty unpleasant stuff coming up because it's just scraped on sort of random material from the internet, and people on the internet tend to be pretty unpleasant people sometimes.
Oh, golly. So Rima, what about
a very
you?
funny example of that, Henry, by the way, is that there's some great examples where for various things you're typing to GPT-3, it was drawing very heavily on like adult fiction, which, it's fine. I mean, adult fiction has its place, right? But you don't want to sort of have something just generate a bunch of material from adult fiction for you without sort of being aware of the source and how that's going. And like if you contacted adult fiction writer, you might sort of have a sense that like that's what you were going to get from them. But if you have like a neutral algorithm and it just starts outputting that sort of stuff, that can be pretty problematic.
Well, this is just very quickly on a personal thing. I wanted to use, there's an implementation of GPT-3 called AI Dungeon, which is a kind of a Dungeons and Dragons type simulator. And I wanted to use it with students this semester, but then I started playing around with it myself and realized that I'm sort of, it can just go off on tangents, generating these scenarios, which I wouldn't necessarily want my students to be involved in. And I just have visions of myself and sort of being paraded across the New York Times or similar about what kinds of horrific things have been inflicted on some poor student who had just typed in some perfectly innocuous suggestion about how he or she wanted to go into a castle, and then all sorts of horrible things unfold which are not suitable for a general audience.
Yes, Henry Farrell, rogue professor or some such, yes. So Rima, what about you? How good are you at protecting yourself from the machine of data that we're all feeding?
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, you get these little cookie things that pop up, and I'm always the person, I'm the contrary person that's sort of clicking reject or trying to find the bit on these cookie notices that allows me to give the lead. So, I do what I can, but actually it's the structural things, the design of the system that is really interesting. Facebook's a great example of this. I joined in the very early iteration of Facebook. This was before it was available to mass public. I was one of the very few
An early adopter, I think is the phrase you're looking for.
I remember the heady optimism. People love this thing. And so I've been on this platform for too long, frankly, over the years. My profile is still there, but I don't use it anymore. And I think that's really interesting because, as I've kind of grown and matured and learned more, I'm far less active on there, despite the fact that, my entire family's on there, active, my social network's also there. So that's kind of interesting. I mean, I really do think that the reality is that there's limited agency, that we have to opt out of these systems, but a fair bit of agency or ability to influence organizations think about building alternatives to these systems. So that's what I'm really interested in. So a lot of what we're thinking about at the Lovelace Institute. Glen mentioned collective bargaining. That's quite interesting. Things like data cooperatives, a lot of emerging thinking about data cooperative, data trust, and how you engender what we're calling participatory data stewardship. So
Glen, come on, last minute
participatory
data.
I'm worse than Henry and Rima. I do not use Facebook for the reasons that Henry said, but I have to admit I'm quite unthoughtful in my data practice online. I was very grateful by the changes to defaults that Apple did. Fundamentally, I just don't think this is a burden that most of us as end users should be taking on. It's like, it's like asking people that rather than there being recycling trucks that come to take your recycling, for everyone to have to go and carry their recycling, to the town. Like in the absence of any public services and collective representation, asking everyone to just take care of those things is not a very sustainable setup for providing infrastructure.
It takes ages to find the reject all button. I mean, really.
I've been working at it recently, but I have to agree with you. I'm not sure I always understand what I'm doing either. That has been. Go on, Henry.
The reject all cookies thing. Glen and I, when we're in the United States, we don't get that. I come over to Ireland and I find, so you don't have the option to reject cookies in the United States. You don't have the option to do this. It's a pain, it's a nuisance, but under US law, you just you get the cookies that you're served with, and you don't have any way to opt out.
So you have to have your cookie and eat it. On that note, I'm going to end this fantastic conversation. I have enjoyed it so much and learned so much. Thank you very much to our contributors, to Rima, to Henry, and to Glen. It's been a great conversation. And just to let you know,
thanks to you.
It's a pleasure. And later this month, I and Agile Rabbit will be in a field. We're going to the Standon Calling Festival, where we'll be talking about psychedelics, Mars, and oceans. I really look forward to it and hope to see some of you there. Thank you very much. Good night.